Great. I think we're good to go. Bore da, good morning. Welcome to today's event. My name is Oriel Miller. I'm the director of the Institute of Welsh Affairs, the IWA, Wales's leading independent think tank, and we've long had an interest in renewable energy and net zero. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation because I've read your piece, it's fine. And to hearing what Andy's got to say and what our respondents have got to say, and hearing what everybody else in the room has got to say too. We've got lots of time for Q&A a little bit later on. First of all, I'm going to introduce the panel, and then I'm going to hand over to Andy for our presentation. So on my right, I have Andy Regan, who leads Nesta's Sustainable Future mission in Wales, focusing on reducing carbon emissions from homes, and in the wake of COVID, boosting productivity and helping people find good work. Before joining Nesta, Andy worked with me at the IWA, so it's really nice to be on a panel together and to hear how his work is developing even more. And with us, he oversaw our research strategy in looking at a successful, clean, green and fair economy for Wales. He's also an energy person through and through, I think it's worth saying, so has long experience of working with at Ofgem and before that with Citizens Advice, so co-chairing the Fuel Poverty Coalition, Cymru. So welcome, Andy. On my left, we have Dr. Jennifer Baxter, who's the Deputy Chair of the National Infrastructure Commission in Wales. If you want to find out what the National Infrastructure Commission is doing, read their I thought very good annual report out just before Christmas. Jen is also a board member of Industry Wales and Newport City Homes. In her day job, she's a senior engineering advisor and head of Wales for Protium, which is a green hydrogen developer. Jen's previously a chief engineer of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, responsible for quality assurance and engineering knowledge management. So really great to have you with us, Jen. Ben, I don't have a long CV for you on my sheet, I'm afraid. On my left here, we've got Ben Berggraff, and I hope I'm pronouncing your surname correctly.
You did a good job, yeah.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
I've heard much worse than that.
Okay, good. Ben is the first CEO of Net Zero Industry Wales, which has been recently set up in autumn to... well, we're going to hear more about what Net Zero Industry Wales is going to be doing, having moved from Dŵr Cymru, where he was head of energy. And my understanding is that Net Zero Industry Wales, and you can correct me a bit later on, Ben, if this isn't correct, is there to support the South Wales industrial cluster to help plan and shape a route great, I'm getting thumbs up, for net zero for industries across South Wales. So we'll hear more about that later, because certainly I think from where we sit, from an overview of all sorts of different policy areas, understanding the landscape is often the first step, and people make lots of assumptions about knowing what organisations are there to do, how they may complement each other. So I'm looking forward to more on that. Now, nothing in terms of housekeeping other than fire exit is down the stairs, folks. And if you're joining us on Zoom, you're very welcome as well. I'm going to hand over to Andy for your presentation, and then we'll have a response from Jen and Ben, and then we'll open out for lots of discussion. Andy.
Okay, thanks, Oriel. Nice to be back on a panel with you talking about energy again. So there's quite a lot to say about how energy networks need to change, and I've only been given 5 minutes to start, so I'm going to just focus on one really specific question and hope that the other issues around, just transition and the respective role of the market versus government and things that we're going to come on to later. But I'm just going to start with kind of exploring one question around control and decision making, which is basically, should we devolve the grid to Wales? So that's something that our energy minister, climate minister, I should say, has called for. So I'm going to just kind of explore that question because it raises a few different things that we can think about. So before answering it, I just want to say a little bit about my own kind of priors and to an extent what Nesta thinks about this. So my personal view is that the way we should be making decisions about anything on net zero is starting with the question, does this increase the pace of what we're doing? So if we're talking about energy grids, are we making decisions that increase the pace at which renewables are installed, or at which homes can be switched to electric heat sources, or that electric vehicles can be attached to homes? and that's very much core to like Nesta's work, is focused on domestic decarbonisation. So that's the question we should start with, and we should always be prioritising that for reasons that Rhiannon's touched on in the opening remarks, and I'm sure I don't need to kind of spell out to people here. Ministers in Wales have been repeating the line for quite some time that we need to achieve as much decarbonisation in the next 10 years as we've achieved in the previous 30 years, so I'm assuming they're kind of largely on board with the idea that we need to speed things up. But we also need to think about front-loading reductions in carbon emissions from all kinds of sources. So a wind farm built in 2023 is going to be worth more to us than one built in 2030. See also a heat pump installed in a home to replace a gas boiler. So I would really like kind of the decision-making to be guided by the principal question of, does this speed things up? So we're talking about the grid in Wales, and I'm on my kind of 10th anniversary box set of talking about the grid in Wales. It feels like not a lot has actually changed in the 10 years we've been talking about this question. We're still facing constraints, still facing bottlenecks, projects that appear to be viable. We're struggling to come to fruition because of issues around capacity. So calls to devolve the grid to Welsh Government tend to arise from those frustrations and very understandable frustrations that Oriel and I certainly heard a lot about when we were working on energy and community energy at the IWA. So there's a hint of optimism available in recent months, and if we'd had this conversation, this conference rather, on the date it was originally planned, we wouldn't be able to talk about this. But in the last couple of weeks, we've had the publication of the Net Zero review by Chris Skidmore MP, which I have not read all 300 pages of it yet. I've skimmed the bits that I'm most interested in, but I think there's reasons for optimism in that. First, it's a really good and credible piece of work, completely unequivocal in its advocacy of net zero as a goal. Very positive about the economic opportunities that presents. As a recap, it was commissioned by Liz Truss during her brief period as Prime Minister, and I think was partly aimed, if we're honest, at persuading the then Bayes Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg that this was worth doing. Things have moved on since then, as you probably know, but we're still in a place where we've got now several hundred pages of really good, well-evidenced recommendations around how to drive net zero forward. And an encouraging number of references to devolution in it as well. The Development Bank of Wales is given a mention, and warm words about working closely with Welsh Government, which is always, at least it's in there. There's one particular thing that I really kind of leapt out at me, and this is a quote from the review, which says, a cross-sectoral infrastructure strategy by 2025 is something they're calling for. We need to rapidly build and adapt the infrastructure for electricity, hydrogen, other liquid and gaseous fuels and CO2 networks that support our green economy. And this is the key bit. The scale of this challenge and the breadth is too much to be left to the whims of individual projects. Now, that's a slightly different way of saying something that Julie James has also said, which is not wanting to have a developer-led approach in Wales, where upgrades to the grid and increases in capacity to the grid that we have are driven by the needs of individual projects. So, remains to be seen whether the UK government will adopt Chris Skidmore's review wholeheartedly, but there's almost perfect alignment there between what he is saying and what Julie James has been saying for quite some time. So I want to slightly unpack why actually that's quite difficult. So the debates around the grid focus on things like anticipatory investment is the phrase that people often use. So do we need to just upgrade the whole grid now without thinking about a specific project that needs it, knowing that it's going to be needed for something in the future? So my view is, yes, we almost certainly do need more anticipatory investment than Ofgem would have been comfortable with at the point that I was working for them, and that Bayes probably would be. There are calls in the Skidmore review to give Ofgem more of a net zero remit. It's up for discussion what that would look like, but it might drive that kind of level of investment more quickly. Where I think there's divergence between what Skidmore is saying and what my understanding of what Julie James has said in the past, Skidmore has been clear that the anticipation needs to be in anticipation of major sources of generation or demand. And I'm not quite sure that is what's being called for in Wales. I think it's a little bit more like a build it and they'll come situation. So I think there was a debate that kind of highlights this in around 2019, again when I was at Ofgem, and I'm not aware that it's moved on, but it's more a kind of illustrative example, two of the Scottish islands, so the Shetland and the Western Islands, were both bidding to Ofgem for a transmission connection. Shetland was awarded it at that time because it had viable projects ready to go. Western Islands was told it needed to bring forward more evidence that there was a need for a transmission link to the mainland. But the argument that political representatives on the Western Islands were making was that, you know, we're a more deprived community. If this connection was in place, then people would step up and start doing community energy projects in order to make use for it. But you need to give us that connection first in order that they can do that. And Shetland is in a kind of socio-economically different position. So it's a little bit of a kind of chicken and egg situation, but obviously the situation that the regulator is trying to avoid, and I'm not talking for Ofgem today, but like I've had to understand this argument in the past, is that you essentially, the chicken and the egg being, do you build the project first or get the grid connection first? What they're trying to avoid is a situation where you invest in huge numbers of poultry sheds when you don't got chickens or eggs to put in them. So you're not upgrading the grid for something that doesn't get used, because it's very, very expensive to do it. So my argument, I think, here today is that if you were to devolve control of the grid to the Welsh Government, the understanding of that would be essentially that it would start to drive more of that anticipatory investment. I think that's what people are talking about, that we would just start to have a comprehensive grid upgrade in Wales on a strategic timeline. That's what Skidmore's calling for as well, and that you would know which bits of the grid are getting an upgrade and when. What I think makes this difficult, and I haven't got to the bit of the Skidmore review that tells me how it's going to fix this yet, is that you're going to still have projects that are live. You're still going to have projects that are in an advanced state of development. Do you kind of scupper those projects by a shift to a kind of much more planned approach? And also, if you're interested in a just transition as an outcome of grid upgrade, and you're trying to stimulate community level projects, which is again is what we were interested in at the IWA, having more projects happening that were owned in Wales and delivering a return to Wales. If you're choosing a bit of Wales that's going to get an upgrade before another bit of Wales, then you're also potentially handing an opportunity to one community that you're not providing to another community. So I'm not completely sure how you can transition away from a situation where having a good viable project with planning permission, with finance, with a workforce in place is not driving the grid upgrade, instead of this idea that you can just upgrade it all ahead of need. One kind of final thing just to mention that I think is also important in this is one of the ways that we'll achieve that front loading of decarbonisation is thinking about how we can use the grid we've got more flexibly. So for example, in the housing domain where we're working at Nesta, we have a project, we're very focused on heat pumps. We think they're the best available solution for decarbonisation, not an easy thing to implement. But we're looking at how a heat pump's heat demand can be flexed to respond to peaks in demand and therefore peaks in carbon intensity, in order that you can make better use of the grid you've got and not needing to have huge levels of increase in headroom and upgrade in order to unlock heat pump rollout or indeed renewable generation. And I think that's something that's also quite underrepresented in Wales in our thinking. And looking at the last energy generation in Wales report, we've not got much by way of kind of grid level battery storage projects as well, which are a really important part of flexibility and enabling us to have more of this kind of investment in new renewables, EVs, heat pumps in homes, etc., before the grid upgrade is needed. Because what we can't do is put infrastructure in place to devolve it. You know, an entirely new regulatory framework would be needed to plan all these upgrades today. None of that activity actually gets us the decarbonisation we need any sooner. So if we were to decide, like aside from the politics that would be involved in this actually happening, if there was a decision to devolve the grid to Wales, you would spend arguably much of the next 5 to 10 years making that happen, putting the infrastructure in place, like the kind of civil infrastructure in place to do that, and not actually just focusing on what we could be doing in terms of getting really good projects moving here now. So I'll stop there, I think. There's lots more to say on this whole issue, but I just thought I'd start with that one.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Andy. So some key provocations here for us all. And just before we move on to hear what Jen and Ben have got to say, could you put your hand up, please, if you are working in energy specifically or net zero related things specifically? Can I have some hands? Okay, so we've got a very well-informed audience. I'm expecting some really good questions later on. So some really key issues here about grid as an enabler to get us that pace and change, and some issues that I want to pull out of the conversation about what are we aiming for, how are we aiming for it, who is going to both deliver it and who is it going to benefit, and why is that the best choice that we can be making. Jen, give us your thoughts, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks, Andy. There's quite a lot in everything that Andy said, so I'm not going to address all of it because I think we'd probably be here all day, and I'd really like to hear what everybody else has to say. So I'm going to talk about some things that I know about and my experience over the last few years of actually trying to build renewables in Wales. One thing I would say is that when we talk about net zero, or now mission zero, because obviously we've renamed it so we'll be able to deliver it, we need to think about what is it that our vision of the future actually is. So we're really talking about electrification. We're going to try and electrify as much as possible and produce as much electricity as possible and move away from actually what is the larger part of our energy system, which is gas and oil. So we're working at the moment on a really good day in the UK with renewables, we produce about 10% of our entire energy system using renewables. So that gives you kind of a benchmark of how far we've got to go. In Wales, it's variable, and I think you'll see different results depending on who you ask about how much electricity we produce using renewables, but it's a very small amount. So grid is the most important thing. At the moment, the vision that we have for Wales is unachievable. We cannot deliver renewables in Wales because we don't have the ability to export electricity to the grid. Now, that is much worse in South East Wales than it is perhaps in other bits of Wales, but it doesn't exist. So we can't pretend that it does. So grid is the only focus that we should have right now if we want to create an electrified future. Now, what that then means is that these cables that we talk about, they're absolutely vast, they're huge, they cost billions of pounds, and they take years to deliver. So we have to have a bit of a reset of what is our time frame around delivery of electrification in Wales. And are we going to look at different sources of electrification beyond renewables? Now, when we take a step away from grid, away from infrastructure, and we start to think about how, well, my vision of Wales is, it's a green and beautiful place. It has many hills and opportunities for us to enjoy our environment here. And I don't want to see it become entirely industrialised. So how do we manage that? So there's an element of building with nature, understanding our biodiversity and the role that that plays when we want to develop things like wind farms in our area. So if you take things like peatlands, for example, they provide a flood defence, a carbon store, they provide biodiverse wildlife area, but it's also a great place that people want to build wind turbines. And we regularly hear, well, actually, we can do a lot around peatlands. No, you can't, just don't touch them. Leave the carbon and methane where it is, allow them to do their job. And I think we have to be a little bit more strict about that. So within Andy's paper, there was an element around decarbonise as much as possible and then work out the just element of it. And I feel that actually, who do we think we are to destroy the rest of Earth's environment? We have to actually think about the problem more wisely up front and do more planning. So there are systems thinking is where we have to get to this. So some of the problems also come further up the manufacturing line, for example. So how are we producing our wind turbines? How are we producing our solar panels? How are we managing all of the materials around them? If we move to greater EVs, now, I have an EV, and if anyone wants to read my blog about my experience of being an EV driver for a couple of months, it's on my LinkedIn, you're very welcome to it. But basically, there's no infrastructure, and that exists, half of it doesn't work anyway. So we are so far away from this place. And I am an environmentalist and a conservationist in equal measures. I want this to happen, but we are looking at it through the wrong end of the telescope. So we have to stop thinking about technology, start thinking about enablers, start thinking about what we want the future to look like, so that then we can actually start to do better long-term planning. And I think that's part of where Skidmore's trying to get to. But I would also say, what has he said that is different to what Stern said in 2006? And I heard a lot recently on the radio, always based it in the economy, that's great, that's literally what Lord Stern did. It's the same thing, we're just going round in circles. So we need to kind of step out of that loop and actually start moving forward. So I won't say more on that because I really want to hear what everyone else has to say and to tell me that I'm completely wrong and it's much better than I think it is. So I'll pass back to you there.
Jen, thanks very much. I really like the clarity of it. The only focus we should have is around the grid, having been spending quite a lot of time talking about the grid over the last 6 years. I think, the point about Skidmore versus Stern, different messengers for different political times, perhaps. But,
Maybe.
we'll come back to that. Ben, share your thoughts, please.
I think Jen just stole my thunder a bit.
Okay,
to be fair.
great.
I think this whole system thinking is very important because it's called energy networks, but you need to look at the energy system. I often hear that Wales is a net exporter of energy, which is actually an untrue fact because it is heavily dependent on fossil fuels. So for industry alone, we have 100 terawatt hours of fossil fuels entering our businesses. And then only a little bit then trickles out of the network, and it's only small in comparison, but 8 terawatt hours per year gets exported to the rest of the UK in electricity. So we're a net export of electricity, but we're a huge consumer of energy. And I think we need to really unblock that. And what we are aiming for with energy networks and energy system is we want to be a fossil fuel free energy system. And for me, when we talk about designing grid, we really need to think about what is our objective here. And our objective is to make it fossil free. So if that's the case, let's just then also design a grid that is suitable for that, rather than taking the piecemeal approach of actually just taking the developer-led. So I really value Chris Skidmore's point on that and make it mission number one, because grid is the important factor. And particularly when we look at very successful industrial clusters in Europe and other places, and also where a lot of investment is taking place, is first of all having the right culture. Now, I think we have the right culture, and that's actually set in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I think it's a fantastic opportunity for us to have. And also when you listen to businesses, I've been only 4 months in post, they have a really clear plan. It may not always be supported by their owners abroad, but they have a real clear vision, and they are grounded in Wales, and they want to stay in Wales as well. So the culture is there. I think what was sometimes missing is probably the alignment in policy. So when we talk about economic, climate change, environmental policies, education, and some of those other aspects, I think there is not. Net zero is a cross-cutting team that needs to be going across. It's not a silo. It needs to be de-siloed and debulked. So there's a lot of work needed, and I think, again, there's the right kind of attitude and tension. It's all about communication. It's about telling stories in the right kind of way. So I think there is a bit of work to be done in that space, but with that big culture we have in place, we can make it happen. I'm really positive about that. And then the third kind of main aspect of this is actually building the infrastructure, because if you look at where investment is taking place in green technologies, you look at Scandinavia, you look at Canada, you look at South America, that is where the investment is taking place, because there's an abundance of green energy, at a cost competitive price. And that is what industry has been lacking probably for the last 20 to 30 years in Wales, because it's been dependent on natural gas from external resources, being driven by a relatively expensive electricity price over the last couple of 20 years. And we can talk about why that is the case, but it is actually always put the businesses that work and operate in Wales in a cost disadvantage compared to its global competitors, because some of them have more heavily subsidized. But that infrastructure and that creating that environment, which one has a green abundance of cost competitive energy, and on top of that with an attractive infrastructure, can really help increase that investment and retain some of those vital industries that, for example, are so important to realize, for example, the floating offshore wind potential. Because if you look at what the untapped floating offshore wind potential is, 50, some say 100, even if you include Ireland in that, that would be our new, real abundance of green energy source that could futurely power, our industries, but also our homes in the future. Now, this infrastructure debate is very important, because the choice of infrastructure and the way you're deploying it is also going to set for future what's going to happen. So if you, for example, say Mid Wales doesn't get access to the electricity grid and only dependent on hydrogen, you're going to probably, due to the efficiency differences in heating a home doing that way, you will probably put them at a cost disadvantage. So in a just transition perspective, and the pace of change in some of the infrastructure challenges really will determine for future generations how they're going to heat and also run their businesses. So this infrastructure piece is absolutely vital. And for me, there's one solution to this problem. And the solution is that we're already putting £1.5 to £2 billion into the UK Treasury from Welsh businesses under the UK ETS scheme. What we need to have, instead of having that coming into a black hole, Covens, we have to think about how that is coming to recycle back into Wales to support some of the investment. And one of the reasons why Ofgem is not doing any investments upfront is because they need to have an evidence base, because that costs need to be put on top of the consumer. But what if we would use some of this UK ETS money, which is there going into Treasury, directly related to carbon emissions, to actually start decarbonizing the grid and do some of this upfront investment and fund it through that way rather than through the electricity bills, which has always been the case. So I think we really need to think about how we recycle this disproportionate amount of money, because if you look at per capita, it's much higher than the UK average. How do we can recycle some of that money back? And I think that is probably more important than some of the devolved, powers we might get, because we need to find a real good funding stream that actually creates this upfront strategic investment and doesn't look the bottom-up way.
That's great. Can you just unpack for everybody else in the room and online the ETS scheme just a little bit, because not everybody may know what you're talking about, please.
So all large carbon emitters, in the UK, following Brexit, are having, because there was also EU emission trading scheme, and these are significant large emitters. So we talk about the Tatas, the Valeros, the Valleys, the Rockwools, the Celsas, all of the large industrial activity, but also the power station like RWE in Pembrokeshire. They will have to buy carbon credits, so from the open market. And there's a cap being placed each year on how much credit can be traded. There's also certain companies which are at risk of carbon leakage. They've been given free allocations, and this carbon price is currently trading at around 60 to 80 pounds a tonne at the moment, and it's about 10 pounds actually more expensive than the EU, because there's only limited amount of liquidity at the market at the moment. But what's happening in the near future, in 2023, 24, there's a significant drop in the amount of cap that's come through to make the scheme actually net zero aligned, which is actually a big shock to some of these businesses, because there's less free allowances available, roughly a quarter, will likely in the short term almost quadruple or triple some of these values in prices, which puts a big additional cost element to those companies. But away from the whole competitor side, there is a lot of money being generated through that scheme, which currently goes into UK Treasury. And I think a lot of my industrial members would like to see a direct relationship between the money they put into the scheme, go into Treasury, and what kind of investment, particularly on infrastructure, because the infrastructure development, for example, upgrading the grid in Milford Haven and actually landing floating offshore wind, putting in a hydrogen pipeline between Milford Haven and Port Talbot, will unlock further investment from their owners.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed, Ben. You got straight to the nub of some of the other things around this, which is around governance and finance and fiscal flows across the UK and how they work. So my IWA radar going, wow, wow, wow. These are things that we need to pick out much more. Great. We're going to open things up to everybody in the room, and are we able to take questions from people online? WCPP staff? No, sadly.
Live isn't working.
Okay.
Just recording.
Sorry about that, everybody. So we've got some challenges here, haven't we, in terms of what we want and how we want it, and what does that mean for everybody working in the various different bits of the system. How energy networks need to change to meet those decarbonisation targets at pace, and responding to that requires switch to renewables. How political control over that process can be exercised given that kind of cross-border nature of those networks too. What the role is for the market in that process as well. How regulation can help the private sector to rise to that decarbonisation challenge Andy was talking about. And how we promote that just transition as we're doing it as well. So I'm not going to use the analogy of building the road as we go along, because we're not road building. So share your thoughts, people in the room. What are your questions? Now, I'm not afraid. I'm very proud to always have a policy of taking the first question from a woman, because the evidence shows you get more questions from women afterwards. So I'd like a question from a woman, please, first. And if nobody puts their hands up, then I will take a question from a man. Anybody? Thank you very much. Thank you. Would you like to introduce yourself and say who you are? Because, again, it's the opportunity to know who's in the room and who else we can work with.
Okay, so my name's Janet Dwyer, and I'm on the programme speaking this afternoon on land use. So I hesitated to put my question. I was hoping some others would come first, because I'm a little bit I'm thinking about rural resources and rural futures. and I'm working both in respect of kind of land use and the land using sectors, but also in thinking about rural settlements, rural housing, and some of the challenges in respect of a vision which is about electricity. When you live in a small rural community and all around you you've got small woodlands that are neglected, undermanaged, you've got a variety of options, and electricity seems the most expensive, the most difficult and the least secure for thinking about your future going forward. I just wondered what the panel's views might be about whether it really is a one-size-fits-all, we have to go for the grid, or whether in rural Wales there might be something a little bit more what I think I understand happens in Denmark, where there's a lot more local communities using combined heat and power and different energy sources to make that shift. Because my worry is, I think, you know, poverty, poor housing, and that huge, great change for domestic users in thinking about moving towards electricity as their main source of heating.
Thanks, Janet. So we don't have a roving mic, so I'm going to have to repeat the question for people joining us online. So the question is essentially around what is the energy future for people living in rural Wales, where electricity may not be the best option for them. It's a very short version of it. Andy, would you like to go?
Yeah. So a few things within the question. So I mentioned that at Nesta we're particularly focused on heat pump adoption as a replacement for gas combi boilers. Now, a lot of people in rural communities will not have a gas combi boiler in the first place. They'll have, you know, Calagas or oil boilers or something like that. Evidence from my colleague in Scotland, which I'm hoping to repeat for Wales, looking at heat pump adoption in Scotland, is showing that heat pumps are being adopted more in the rural off-grid areas of Scotland than in the towns and cities. I think largely because that is the option that they have. So if the oil boiler or whatever it is comes to the end of its life, going onto some sort of mains gas system is not the option. So people are choosing heat pumps more in rural areas, and there's a little bit of evidence that, from what I have done in Wales, to suggest the same thing might be happening if you look at where MCS accredited heat pumps have been installed. So rural households are being electrified in terms of their heat. So whether it's like your concern was about cost. So there's, I think, two things to say about the cost of that. The first would be remembering that an electric air source heat pump actually is a big energy efficiency saving measure. So it uses about a third of the energy that a gas boiler would use. I'm not sure exactly how it compares with an oil boiler, but it's about a third of the energy that you would be paying for if you had a gas combi boiler. So that's a potential saving, as well as obviously directly decarbonising at source. Removes the kind of inconvenience of having to get gas and oil shipped into you. But the other thing, and this slightly links back to what Ben was saying about electricity prices, and it's another thing that's been highlighted probably for the nth time by the Skidmore review, is we've made political decisions about what electricity and gas costs in this country. You know, some of the subsidies that we pay are loaded onto gas bills, should be moved onto gas bills from electricity. Things like the Energy Company Obligation Scheme, some of the renewables levies, and also the way that the kind of wholesale market is set up so that the price of gas sets the cost of all renewable energy generation, which this is not a trivial thing to fix, but if that were to be fixed, to decouple those very high gas prices, as well as reducing our dependency on gas, we wouldn't be in the position that we're in now in terms of what electricity would cost the household in a rural community. And of course, I probably can say this very briefly because I doubt there's any dissent in the room about it, but we should of course be thinking about how to insulate properties so we're getting electric heat pumps too. So I think that's how I'd address some of the concerns that people you work with might have.
Thank you. I'm going to go back out to the room rather than go through everybody because we'll get more questions. Gentleman in the green shirt.
Thank you very much. I'm Philippos Proedrou. I'm a senior lecturer in global political economy and program director of the MBA Global at the University of South Wales. I've been working on energy issues for more than a decade now. I have also advised the work at the Welsh Parliament a couple of years ago, just pre-COVID, so it seems like a decade ago. So I would like to further challenge this centralization and grid-based bias. I very much agree with what you say about electricity prices, and the European Commission is now actually at the forefront of a reform of the electricity market pricing system. So electricity is not so expensive, especially to generate it domestically. So as long as the whole global value chain is domesticated, prices, renewable electricity prices can be very low. My whole point is that decarbonization should not just be we replace gas and coal and oil with renewable energy, but it's exactly the systems thinking you touched upon, that we can do things differently. So for me, it's about, first of all, reducing the needs of the grid, and then seeing how we can replace it. For me, my understanding is that before we insulate every home, which is a just transition measure, and it's also a low-hanging fruit, we cannot actually talk about extension of the grid, because it is empowering, it ties with a lot of social goals, and it's something that we can do starting tomorrow. And it also ties with domestic goals about net zero skills, about more jobs, more money recycled in Wales. So I would think that systems thinking would tell us reduce energy needs, because energy is a service, doesn't have to be a product, tie to other social goals and to the Welsh economy, and then see what you do, or at the same time see what you do with the grid. But a lot of what can be covered doesn't need to be covered centrally. It can be covered more autonomously, not just in Mid Wales, but in South East Wales and so on.
So the challenge is reducing the need for drawdown.
For transport, for example, you definitely need more renewable capacity to drive the trains and so on in a decarbonized way. For homes, you can use half the amount of energy if you insulate properly, if you legislate solar panels at the roofs and so on. There are many ways to do that. It's about agency and legislation and finance, and we can touch upon those.
Great. So the question is, what are we using our energy for? How do we reduce it? And how do we change our behaviour and ensure that we don't need what we're currently using that energy for? Jen?
So I don't disagree with what you're saying. I think it makes a lot of sense, but I can also see a situation where when we wait to make sure that we've insulated everything or we've reduced everything we need, that we're actually 20 years further down the line and we've done nothing at all. So there is a need to have parallel ways of doing it. If you do multiple things, it's much lower risk than just trying to do one thing, because everything's then got to line up to deliver it. I think there's also a little bit of, so this reduce, reuse, recycle is being applied to all sorts of things. And I've seen it in infrastructure recently as well. Like if you don't need it, don't build it. But actually we are going into a future that hopefully will, transform the way we live our lives, will be very different. And so we should be developing things differently. We should just be doing it better than we do, rather than looking at the way that we currently do it. So I think when we think about grid, even if you, there were lots of things I didn't talk about early on, but even if you think about microgrids or localized grid, the focus is still on grid. And when you think about rural communities, there's ways of system thinking around agriculture, ecotourism. You need electricity for more than just housing, it's for vehicles and all sorts of other things, where you can create small clusters of energy development. And that should be kind of like how we're looking at the future. But all of that takes time, and it all requires more tricky thinking than we've been prepared to do up to this point. Most of what we do is, as you say, it's low-hanging fruit. And whenever anyone says that now, I think there can't be anything left in that fruit basket at all. Or we're just not delivering it and it's all rotting away. So we need to actually start thinking harder about the problems, doing better planning for them, and then implementing them. Whereas what we tend to do is we have an idea, net zero being one of them. Here's a really great idea, and everyone goes, yeah, we'll all start doing things, give us some money and we'll deliver stuff. And then not a lot happens, so we have a review of it, and then we just go round in the cycle again. So I think Skidmore's probably right about better planning, about bringing things together in a better way. But I do worry that if we look at it in a linear way, we just won't make any progress. And I would really love to see, before I retire, having taken my environmental engineering degree in the late 90s, that actually we are making some progress, because I feel 25 years in that we haven't made much. And I'm having the same conversations over and over again. So I would love to see from the implementation of what's now Mission Zero that there is some serious planning about what it is that we're trying to achieve, and we start to deliver it. And that will represent how serious we are about decarbonisation. Or even if you look at it locally as just what Wales wants, not what the UK wants or the world wants. If Wales wants to exist in a certain way in the future and have jobs and skills and opportunities for people equally in rural, urban, suburban areas, we have to just look at the problem differently. And I think that's the biggest challenge that we've got at the moment.
So I guess my question then, Jen, is what do we need to do differently? Oh, and maybe Jane, that's something that you're going to be doing in your new group. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But what do we need? What needs to change, Ben?
I think we lost the time to do this in a continuous improvement way, because what you're saying is just let's just do things over time. And if we would have started in the 80s, when actually we're starting to make noises about climate change already, then I think we would have had a fair chance of actually limiting what we want to do now. The reality of the matter is that we run out of time, and that will mean that we have to make a step change. And a step change is significantly more difficult to achieve, to do it in the way you talk about. So we need to then take risks. We need to take probably how to call it a multiple parallel kind of approach. We can't bet on one horse. And we have to take how to call it an approach where we just say, you know what, we need to make some strategic decisions, and probably 80% of that will be taken up. And we need to accept that there will be some waste. Yeah. And I think that is because we need to expect that we need the 80-20 rule is probably really applicable in this particular case, because we can't get it 100% right. I think you're absolutely right. I've done exactly what you've done. I'm in my home. I've achieved a 50% reduction through what you said. It is possible. So it is physically possible, but it takes money. One other point to comment on that. We talked about land use earlier. Being previously in Welsh water, we also need to think about climate adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
Because the peatland, where Jen was managing, the woodlands, which you talk about, the actual proper management of that can provide a huge amount of climate adaptation provision, and that will prevent a lot of carbon, particularly embodied carbon, through cement and steel structures to be built to protect us against flooding. So I think we really need to think about what land is going to do for us, not only for mitigation, absorbing carbon, more important, to protect us against climate, the effects of
extreme
climate
weather,
change.
yeah.
And I think that is sometimes missing when we talk about offshore wind, because we're not onshore wind, we're not balancing that well enough, in my view.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a quick response from Andy, then the gentleman in the third row, and then is that Rhiannon at the back? Great.
Yeah, I'll try and make this really quick then. Just to come back again on the point on homes and trying to reduce demand before doing the grid. So I essentially agree with what Jen has said in terms of doing things in parallel and not having the luxury of time in that regard. I think it's also just really important to think about who are we talking about? Who is the person whose decision we are talking about? Because I think, particularly in Wales, where so much like retrofit activity has been government funded historically, what we're helping the Welsh Government to think about in the partnership we have with the Development Bank of Wales is how to get private homeowners, people who are going to have to pay for it themselves, to do something. And so ideally, in a perfect world where there were no other considerations, we would want people to be saying, right, I have a budget of X and I want to achieve the greatest possible carbon reductions from my home by spending that budget. The answer to that question is going to be a heat pump, because per pound spent, you get a greater level of carbon emissions abatement from a heat pump than you do from the same money spent on insulation. Now, that's not what homeowners are trying to achieve when they think about retrofitting their home. They're thinking about demand reduction, saving money on energy bills. So there is a tension there, which we've explored with some behavioural insight work with the Development Bank. And we've found one of the things is that solar panels are the most popular thing that people would consider borrowing money from to do, to upgrade their home. And this slightly takes me back to my point about what's the fastest route. That's not to say you should always choose the fastest route, but you should know what the fastest route is so that you know when you're deviating from it. And we've got this real tension with electrification of heat being where the fastest reductions and greatest reductions per pound is available. And this very understandable, and I used to be the chair of the Fuel Poverty Coalition, so I'm completely on board with any amount of additional money being spent on insulation, but that is better thought of as something that helps people with their finances and their health than it is as being about the best possible decarbonisation measure.
That's an interesting point. Gentleman in the third row.
Nick Tune. I'm a commissioner with Jen in the National Infrastructure Commission and also a technical director in Atfields. The question I have is that I think we all realise this is a really difficult thing to do, to deliver. How are we going to actually deliver this in Wales? I think we often look to Welsh Government to be the body that does it for us. I think they often make great policy, like the EV charging policy Jen and I looked at. Brilliant policy, but then delivery on the ground is absolutely nowhere near it. So I don't think we can look completely at the public sector. We've got market failure in the private sector, which is always the case with, I think, virtually everything we look at. Do we need an organisation like the WDA was set up to do many moons ago, which was actually about coalfield regeneration, bringing industry into the valleys? Now, we'll never hate it, you know, times have moved on since, but there was a bit of a public-private partnership looking at a complex system. Now, this may be even more difficult in terms of complex systems, but I think the current structure we've got isn't going to deliver it. So what is the right structure to deliver it?
Can I throw that out to the room, actually, in terms of are there thoughts in the room? Because you've got a number of different players in different places. So the structures are not set up to deliver against our ambitions at the moment, is what you're saying, Nick. So we have city deals, we have, as bodies, that sort of tripartite arrangement between local authorities, Welsh Government and money from the Treasury too. We have new funding mechanisms replacing EU funding through the Levelling Up funds as well. And the IWA has views on the efficacy of that or otherwise so far. Number of different groups from a point of Welsh Government and arm's length to Welsh Government too. Robert?
Two random thoughts in response. Sorry, I'm got a surveyor background, and dare I say, even in this room, I did work for the WDA for 6 years until 1996. I'm an independent strategic advisor right now. Two thoughts. For me, by proxy, in Wales, we have 4 economic regions. What is their strategy for energy and sustainable energy in those 4 regions? Point one. And is that embedded in their strategies? Is there an action plan? Can that be done at that pace? 2, what about the use of existing tools? CPOs. I mean, Nick, you talked about WDA, it seems like the Land Authority for Wales, who had facilitatory powers, using CPO powers.
Compulsory purchase orders, yeah.
Compulsory purchase orders to secure land, to facilitate things. Is there something there around facilitating? You know, look at Amon Towie, a community organisation. Fantastic what they've achieved, turbines and all the rest of it, sustainable energy, sustainable community use, etc. Took a long time though. We haven't got that time. We haven't got time. We've got to deliver it quickly. So there just needs to be something to facilitate things at pace much more quickly.
So an organisation or a person?
And there's something
Gentlemen,
about planning as well there as well.
thank you. Gentleman in the second row.
Yes, Gary Wellings, I'm Dean of Town here, and did one quickly. Like that gentleman said to me and the lady there, you need off the shelf. We want it now, not 20 years' time. One is the constraints on solar panels going on houses. That needs to be looked at and permission given. I think 2011, 2012. How it was done there is totally different how it was done here. I've been to many discussions on decarbonisation. One hasn't come up from any panel at this present time, an off-the-shelf remedy, and that is eco-fuel conditioners that can be utilised, put into vehicles where you get decarbonisation coming down by 30%, PM down by 61%, and an additional 8% performance on either diesel or petrol. So I don't hear people talking about this, and it's now here, it's off the shelf. And with the Clean Air Act coming out, with Ella's Act, the young lady, a young girl up in London, with the emissions, we need to control these emissions that's coming down, and that's our off-the-shelf remedy now, ready to go.
So are we using what we could already be using?
Are you talking about HVO or what? Just specifically any kind of e-fuels? Right.
The fuel conditioner, the eco-fuel conditioner.
Within the existing, yeah, okay.
It goes in with diesel, goes in with petrol, goes in HVO.
So there's a lot around liquid fuels that doesn't get talked about, and I agree with that. And the Institution of Mechanical Engineers a few years ago actually wrote a paper about the role of e-fuels in the future vehicle system. And I think there's a few things within this. So I agree with you. We should be using those straight away. It's the same with E20. Should be immediately kind of like used as a gasoline replacement. Well, it's just got more biofuel in it. But people don't like biofuels. People have different views of biofuels depending on which country in the world you come from. There's also something called HVO, which is hydrogenated vegetable oil, which is almost a direct replacement for diesel. You can put it in a diesel truck, and if you use waste oil, it's a 90% emissions reduction immediately. And there are already hauliers who are using this, but nobody hears about it because we don't make it here. It all comes from, usually mostly from the Netherlands and Germany, I think. So
can I just say, it's actually going to be made in Port Talbot.
oh, it can be.
Within 2 years' time.
Yeah.
2 years' time.
So I think I'm aware of that project as well. But so this is a good thing. I think one of the things that people worry about is that if you promote a easy solution, things that is government policy, whether it's Westminster or national policy in Wales around EVs, will get less investment because everyone will realise that this is a really easy solution. And that's, so I'm not actually pro one or the other. I think if we can use waste oil to deliver HBO, that's not a bad thing, and we can reduce our emissions immediately using the vehicles we have. Because when it comes to HGVs, whether they're electrical fuel cells, we don't really have any. So this is something that you can actually do immediately. So I kind of agree with you, but it's sort of, there's a variety of different fuels, conditioners, e-fuels or alternative liquid solutions. And again, some of those might be far more appropriate for rural communities than perhaps electrifying the system.
Great, thank you
Can
very
I
much.
just make one
Yes,
comment
Ben.
on that? So I think there are a lot of quick solutions which we're not making use of. And for me, the biggest quicker solution is actually starting a debate with everybody in a non-technical way about what they will need to do over the period of time in small steps to make a change and make their own personal contribution. And what is very poor at the moment is very good, easy to digest information on what personal choices you can make in order to start your journey to net zero.
Yeah.
And people are waiting for the silver bullet because there are a lot of silver bullets being presented to us, whether it's a heat pump, whether it's hydrogen, and they're waiting for it to come. But you can't wait for it to come. In the same way, industry can't wait for a solution. We need to start working on it now. And I think for me, there's the biggest untapped potential is actually communication and having a chat with people about what personal choices they can make. Now, me personally, I'm trying to cycle now in Cardiff everywhere. I ban cars in Cardiff for one reason, because it's too congested anyway. Secondly, it's one of my actions I'm taking on a regular basis. I know other people do the same thing. And I think you need to start thinking, on your own little strategy. And I know I went to a family birthday in the Netherlands. And what were they talking on around the birthday kind of cake and everything else? They were talking about whether they could do heat pumps or anything else. I've never had a conversation like that. With my family prior in the Netherlands, and let alone in the UK and Wales. Because that conversation is not happening. So there needs to be a really big effort to start this conversation, because by the time we have those available, we can't start having those conversations because we need to have them implemented. So then there's a real need to start a real good communications campaign and bring out a really good level of information. People can actually make their own informed choices. And I think that's the biggest link at the moment, is that people are lacking the information to make an informed choice. And I see that now happening. A lot of people in my circle friends, they say to me, Ben, I want to pick your brain because you're an expert in this area. I said, but wait a minute, it should be readily available, not dependent on...
So let's ask the room, who has got a plan or a scheme in their own homes at the moment to bring down their energy demand and to change? So hands up, please. Who has done something actively already in the last year to do that same thing, to do something to bring down your energy demand? Okay, so not everybody is the answer to that. So we should all be having those conversations. Fantastic call to action.
Can I just make one comment on this? I think we have to be really careful that we don't tell individuals that they can solve this problem.
No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm absolutely not suggesting that.
Until we resolve Port Talbot, from an emissions point of view. So I think that we
But
just
it
have
goes
to be
back to that both and parallel streams of work. I'm going to go to Rhiannon at the back, and then I'll take 2 more questions, and we'll see how we're doing on time.
Thank you. So my question, and I don't know the answer to this, but are we doing enough to progress battery storage capacity, given that we've got grid constraints? If you're thinking on an industrial scale, maybe that's already devolved and something the Welsh Government could be progressing with. When you're looking at retrofit buildings, battery storage can enable homeowners to access agile, cheap tariffs to help with cost of living pressures. So is there more that could be done for battery?
Great question. Are we doing enough on battery storage at the moment? Andy?
No. I'm going to say one thing and then I'm going to disagree with myself slightly, which I enjoy doing. The last energy generation in Wales report mentioned that there were 3 large-scale battery projects in Wales, a grid-level battery, which is disappointing because, yes, that could be one big way that we address constraint. I don't really know what the kind of the strategy is, but that's me just genuinely not having looked into it, not a kind of impolite way of suggesting that there isn't a strategy on batteries at Welsh Government level. But yeah, so at grid level, we could be doing a lot more. Household level, I think they're a really good solution for some kinds of homes, but there's other things that work really well too, like heat storage, like having a buffer tank attached to your heat source, particularly if it is a heat pump, so you're storing heat rather than storing electricity. Quite understandable concerns around batteries from the perspective of how they're disposed of. There's lots of kind of dangerous materials in them. Most batteries use loads of cobalt, which mostly comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo and is extracted under kind of slavery conditions. So there's lots of things about batteries that are problematic. So I think it's storage and flexibility in the round, and also thinking about like how we can help individual users reduce demand and have a kind of demand response to kind of help the grid. But yeah, batteries are going to be a big part of the picture, and I'm not happy with the level of battery uptake we have in Wales.
Okay, thank
Can
you.
I just make one?
Sure.
So grid level, I think there's not enough batteries, and I think batteries could be one of the solutions to actually untap some of the unused capacity currently reserved to deal with the max and min peak trough. So I think if you look at 90% of the time, a lot of the network is actually underutilized, but you can't access that network because we have to cater for the peaks and troughs. And batteries can fill that. And a lot of people don't know that the electricity network operators are not allowed to hold their own storage by regulation. So I think one of the key things that should change in my view is that actually the DNOs like Natural Grid or Spen up in North should actually be allowed, similar like the gas networks have, their own gas storage to really manage those peaks and troughs. Because by doing so, they can actually untap some of the restrictions we currently have on the grid in South Wales and other places, which allows more renewables to access, but at the same time more demand to be added, which can aid to actually accelerate some of the decarbonisation. So for me, batteries could be really a good opportunity together with local energy management. On top of that, we see that with Octopus, for example, at the moment with some of the trials they're running, to actually untap some of this unlocked potential before we have the time to actually build larger scale. And that's not going to be the silver bullet, but it will buy us against some time. And I think house level batteries, I think, could have done those other solutions, but to date, it's been not an easy thing to connect the battery up, because again, you need to have DNO approval to do some of this stuff.
So some of the behind the scenes things that need to be worked through. Jen,
Just
yes.
this very brief bit on that. So with batteries, when we talk about batteries and battery farms, I think I have a lot of concerns. The question is, what sort of battery are we talking about? If we're going completely down the lithium route, I think we're going to find ourselves in quite a lot of trouble fairly quickly. Batteries are also expensive and they take up a lot of room for what you are asking them to do in terms of storing energy. And so I think the question becomes like, where do you want to use them? Why do you want to use them that way? And I think sometimes this idea around battery farms for grid feels like maybe the wrong way of storing electricity, and there may be pumped hydro may be a better solution, or some kind of, there's all sorts of wacky ideas, dropping bricks down mine shafts and all sorts of things. But there's all sorts of different ways that we can think about the problem. Flow batteries may be a better solution. Yes. They're less toxic and are also probably less likely to burst into flames. And so I think there's also a carbon fibre issue as well that comes with all of our renewables and our batteries, that we need to kind of start to tackle that element as well. So there's a investment in understanding our materials better. And this all stems back to systems thinking, that when we announce an emergency, everyone just goes bananas and does stuff, but hasn't thought about what the consequences of those things are. And we're starting to see that now with the disposal of wind turbine blades, a lack of battery recycling. And this will just build and build and build. So if we do some better thinking sooner rather than later, we might be able to resolve these problems before our wind farms need to be replaced.
Thank you. We've got a couple of minutes, so have we got any flex on timings, Jack? We're lunch next, aren't we? So I'm going to take one more question. Chair's prerogative. One more question. Gentleman in the... you. No, you. Yeah.
So thanks. So I'm from Planet Cymru, which is a Pan Wales network, 300 organisations, universities, unions, businesses, charities, all sorts. I'm not an energy specialist myself, so
What's your name?
Sam.
Sam. Hi, Sam.
I'm working across lots of different interest areas. So my question is particularly about one region of the grid. North Wales and Mersey region has, and this is something that come up in a campaign we're running on energy, particularly around justice, the intersection between energy, the cost of living crisis, North Wales and Mersey region has the most expensive electricity in the whole country, the whole of the UK, and that is a bit. Well, I guess my question is oriented around that. It's despite being a net exporter, as I understand it, of electricity, a net exporter of renewable or low-cost electricity as well. And then obviously it's one of the more deprived areas of the UK too. And that high cost of electricity is obviously an inhibitor for industry and does mean it sometimes gets left out. Like, for example, the net zero industry, Wales is only interested in the South Wales region, for example, and that's
No, it's not true.
Okay, but I just heard that earlier. That was just an example, so please ignore that if that's not true. But but that's so I guess the first question, I've tried to get to the bottom of why, and I have failed. Basically, there's some political or historical reasons for the pricing being varied, but even the support that was given to help people in the last year or two with energy prices is not balancing that out, even though North Wales is one of the more deprived areas of Wales. So the price cap is higher in North Wales. And so I guess I'm trying to work out why is that now? What's the historical reason for the grids being varying? And then is there anything that should be done to try and bring out that sort of equity and how how do we make that change?
Thanks, Sam. So
I know why.
Just going to repeat the question for people online, that why is the price of electricity so much higher in that particular bit of North Wales? What is the reason for that, and what can be done about it? Ben, should we go to you and then Andy?
So I don't have an answer of what should be done, because it is a very difficult thing. Why it's higher is because the actual network distribution charges on that particular area are very high. And I know that because I used to basically look after 4,000 Welsh water sites, and we had a lot of those sites in there, and I compared it with the South Wales, and there is a distinct difference, in particular on the network and transmission charges in that particular area. And that's been reviewed through the annual kind of review of those charges, and that's a very complex calculation of how that's been pulled together. And I don't even want to pretend why that is the case, but it all has to do with asset value and how you depreciate that over time, what kind of additional investment do you take into place. It's a very complex economic metric model, which is driven by Ofgem, the regulator. And in some particular reason, for that particular network, it's more difficult and more costly to operate that particular infrastructure, that area. And maybe that's because there is a lot of distribution lines, long distance, I don't know. But it is to do with that particular component of the pricing.
So Sam, I'm sorry, we have to move us on. Andy, quick comment on what do we do about it?
What do we do about it? So this harks back to, there was a campaign when I was at Citizens Advice around energy network pricing. So Ben's quite right, the different regions charge different amounts according to essentially how the grid is being managed by the network operators. But there was quite an in-depth bit of modelling that one of my colleagues at Citizens Advice did around whether those prices are justified. So all of the things that kind of feed into the price control, everything from what does copper piping cost, what do we think copper piping will cost in 10 years' time, to like levels of risk, that how risky an investment energy networks are deemed to be, because they're all owned by like things like pension funds and things like that. And the case was made very strongly that on that last point in particular, Ofgem has got it wrong. Energy networks are not a very risky investment, so therefore you should not be seeing rates of return on owning an energy network of like 10% on top of capital, and it should be much lower, because you know, we're all using the energy networks all the time, so getting a return on it is pretty much guaranteed unless everybody's going to kind of go off grid and some kind of Mad Max scenario. So there's reform of kind of grid pricing that's needed, and Ofgem has made noises about kind of moving in that direction, but it's as Ben said, these calculations are complex and take a long time. So
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. I've got 30 seconds, I think, to wrap up. I'm just going to pull together some of the strands that we heard about this morning. Andy set a really good challenge around pace, straight up at the beginning. We've heard about how systems thinking is harder than it looks and than it sounds, and we need to think better and think harder about what are the different parallel streams of work that we could be doing. The sort of 80-20 risk appetite as well, in terms of what we know we're going to fail at some things, but hopefully 80% of it we'll get right. There's some really crunchy stuff around governance and money and who holds that money, who gets to decide where that money flows. Do we know where money is flowing and what can be used? What's in the system already? Is it being used to best effect? Some really practical things around battery storage, and a really good call to action from a communication perspective, both from a policy, in terms of policy influencers and decision makers, but also to the general public. So I think there's a thing for us all to be ambassadors for what those messages are and what those stories are that we should be telling, both in terms of telling the story of the Wales that we want in the future. What does that mean for us in our day-to-day jobs? As what does that mean for us in our wider lives as well? So thank you very much indeed, everybody, for your time. Really looking forward to picking up on other conversations throughout the rest of the day. Thank you to our panellists. And I think we're moving to lunch, which is downstairs. Thank you.